All right, folks, if you're just joining us, my name is Jennifer Wilhelm. I work with the New Hampshire Food Alliance. And if you're not familiar with our network, we are a statewide food systems network, and we are working to support the emerging local food economy. And we offer these free webinars once a month on all sorts of different topics. If you're unfamiliar, you can check out our website and see all of the past webinars that we've hosted. They have been recorded and posted online. So we're going to get rolling. Thank you so much, Alissa White, for joining us today to present. Alissa is joining us from Vermont, and she'll do an introduction of herself and get rolling. We've got a lot to cover today. If you have questions during her presentation, feel free to type the question in the chat. And if it's related to that slide, Alissa will address it then. And if it's a larger question for later, we'll cover it during the Q&A at the end. All right, take it away, Alissa.
Great. So hi, everybody. My name's Alissa White. I'm really honored to be here. So thanks to the New Hampshire Food Alliance for inviting me to share my work. I'm currently a PhD student at the University of Vermont's Plant and Soil Science Department. But I grew up in New Hampshire and studied agroecology, and then worked for farms and in education for about 10 years before I came back to academia. And the research that I'm going to share with you today about how farmers are adapting to climate change in the Northeast really came from my desire to have my academic research experience contribute something back to the community that I know and love in the Northeast. So I work at UVM. My advisors are Joshua Faulkner, who runs the Farming and Climate Change Program for the Center for Sustainable Agriculture and UVM Extension. And then Ernesto Mendez, who runs the Agroecology and Livelihoods Collaborative here. I'm also affiliated with the Gund Institute. And the research that I'm going to share with you today was in part funded by the Northeast SARE graduate student grant, and then the USDA Northeast Climate Hub also gave some financial support to the research project. So as Jennifer said, please just, if you've got a question about clarification on a slide, put it in the chat box and I'll answer it right away. And then I'll be sure to leave some time for us to do discussion at the end. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today, first I'm just going to give you a high-level summary of how climate change is impacting farms in the Northeast. And then I'm going to talk about 3 types of regional research that we've conducted here at UVM. The first is just some big takeaways and advice for folks on climate change research that we gleaned from interviews with extension professionals. We'll talk about the big farmer survey that we conducted, and then a later phase of research where we conducted focus groups and invited farmers to participate in analyzing some of the results of the survey. And then we'll have a little time for discussion. Okay, so how is climate change impacting agriculture in the Northeast here? Well, the big story, especially in the Northeast, I think, is this increase in heavy precipitation events. And we've observed just since 1958 that there's been a 71% increase in the occurrence of those heavy precipitation events in our region. It's really different than the rest of the country, and I think that really dominates kind of the way that we feel and experience climate change here, especially on farms. And that leads to increased flooding and heavy downpours. We're projected to see the incidence and intensity of those heavy precipitation events increase in the coming years. And there's a number of other impacts from climate change, overall increase in temperature, which means also increased humidity, increased CO2 levels, and then this last one, increased periods of drought. And what we see, at least this data here is from some USGS modeling that I gathered, and to look at kind of the precipitation patterns in Vermont specifically. And so this is showing us the projected change in monthly average precipitation between kind of historically at the end of the last century and what we'll see in 2050. And this is in a lot of the other downscaled models. So we'll see more of those precipitation events happen and more precipitation overall in the winter months, and then we'll probably have some periods of drought in late summer. And I think these 2 precipitation extremes, the heavy precipitation events and the flooding, and erosion that occurs with them, and then drought are kind of the two of the biggest concerns for farmers in the Northeast. And they're not new challenges for farmers. They've dealt with those before, but what climate change is doing is it's making those climate impacts worse. So they're kind of at a new level. It's causing new level of risk and damage on farms. Okay, and this chart I think just really hits that home. This is from a study conducted at Cornell and put out last year in 2018, and they looked at crop loss reported to the FSA between 2013 and 2016, and as you can see, over 70% of crop loss reported during that time period was due to either too much water or too little water. So in our research, we've identified those two climate impacts as being kind of the most concern, having the most damage for farms. I think it's really important in this conversation as we talk about climate projections to understand that the modeling indicates that the way that we continue to emit carbon and greenhouse gases really has an influence on the scale of future impacts. So in the next slide here, I try to highlight what the takeaway is. So this image is showing you the increased incidence of rainfall events that are over 5 centimeters. And in the dark green, that's 3 times is what we've seen. I think just plain red is kind of the same as now. And so the top two figures there are showing us what the projections are mid-century and then end of century if we continue to burn carbon in a business as usual scenario. But if we're able to reduce our emissions, you can see in the lower left there that the end of century scenario is really different. And so the takeaway from this research, and this is by the same folks at Cornell, is that if we can reduce our carbon emissions and our greenhouse gas emissions, we can really slow down the degree to which those heavy precipitation events are going to impact climate change by about 50 years if we do a good job. And so I think it's worthwhile to invest in mitigating climate change because we know that it can give us more time to adapt agriculture. Okay, so here are the three research projects that I'm going to talk about. In 2017, we conducted interviews with mostly extension folks, some other agricultural advisors too that work for nonprofits. And we used some of the takeaways from that research to inform the farmer survey that was conducted across the region. And then we did the series of focus groups and farmer-to-farmer sessions. Okay, and so I think it's worth just saying that when we do research and outreach about climate change and agriculture, there are a lot of challenges to this topic. One, climate change it's a complex topic. I think it's perceived as being kind of distant. It's in the future. We don't feel climate change per se in our day-to-day lives. So it's hard to approach because it's kind of out there and it's big and scary, but it's not right here yet. And the second is that there's this sense of urgency. Like we need to act now. We need to have acted yesterday to address it. So it's complex. We're not sure how to deal with it, but we feel like we should be doing something already. And the third piece that makes it really challenging to do research and outreach about climate change is that it's increasingly politicized. So when we talk to extension professionals, we ask them what works and what doesn't in terms of talking to farmers about climate change, in terms of what information is usable for farmers. How do we do and research on climate change with farmers? Because we know that extension has been doing this already and they've been doing a good job of it. And I think there was a lot of great advice from those conversations, but the two that I want to point out today, the first is that they suggested that information is more usable to folks if it's one level down from climate change. So rather than talking about that big topic of overall climatic disaster, let's talk about climate impacts. And that's where really the lived experience and the managed experience on farms is. So farmers are already changing their management to account for increases in heavy precipitation events. They all have a story to tell about that. A lot of folks have really had to change the way that they farm due to the increased incidence of drought. And so talking about climate change at at the level of climate impact is where you get to solution-based conversations. And the second piece of advice that they offered us is that the research needs to be context specific, and so does the outreach. So how all farmers are adapting to climate change is really not that usable to me if I'm a farmer in the floodplain and I'm growing vegetables. You know, if I'm going to have really different vulnerabilities and adaptation strategies compared to maybe a dairy farmer up on some clay soils. And so we need to compartmentalize some of the research and outreach towards kind of these production contexts or these similar vulnerabilities. So we took that advice and we used it to help design this regional survey, which we called the New England Adaptation Survey for fruit and vegetable growers. And there's a report out about that we can link to if you want to read all of the results. I'm going to give you some of the high level results, but basically we decided to focus on 2 climate impacts and 1 production context. So we picked increased incidence of heavy precipitation events and increased incidence of drought. We asked farmers about how they're adapting to those climate impacts and what strategies they consider to be innovative and promising for helping them manage those risks. And then we decided to work with vegetable and fruit growers because that's where I had personal experience. I had worked on farms in high school and then at other times in my life with farmers like that. And so I feel like that was the best place for me to start. I had social capital, I was connected with people, and I also understood a lot of kind of the production constraints there. And so we did kind of pick this specific context to work with and this community to work with, but what we found is that some of the results of the research are transferable to other farming contexts. And I think that there's an opportunity to do more research with other types of farmers, but also some lessons for all of us. Okay, so we basically took this survey. It was too long because it was I was a new master's student and I wanted to know everything. So we took this really long survey to farmer network meetings around northern New England. And we asked farmers to take it. We gave them chocolate. They were so, they were willing to take the survey. And I think in some of the meetings, we were surprised at how positive the response was. I'll just say that some of my advisors at UVM were concerned that nobody was going to talk to me about climate change because it was so political, or that we were only going to get responses from really kind of progressive and regenerative farmers and that wouldn't be representative. But there are a lot of those big conservative farmers that I met all over the region. They were thanking us for showing up and talking about climate change because nobody else was doing it in a big way at that time. And they all had a story to tell. You know, some of the older farmers say, "Let me tell you about climate change. You know, in the 70s, it was like this. I never had to put in irrigation, but I did it last year after 40 years of farming because now I can't count on the rain coming." So anyways, we partnered with farmer organizations to send out the survey, and we're really appreciative of those partners in making it happen. And we got about 200 responses from Canada to Pennsylvania. This is what the report looks like. There's a PDF online, and we're hoping that it can be useful to people. So check it out if you want to learn more after the end of the webinar. Okay, just to give you a quick sense of who took the survey, mostly it was either farm owners or full-time farmers, and then primarily folks that grow vegetables, but then also fruit and tree fruits and lots of other things. You know, agriculture is very diversified in the Northeast and New England. So this is kind of just to give you a sense of who the data represents. And then, you know, the average age of people who took the survey is a little bit younger than the national average age for farmers, but still 47. It's a lot more, our survey responses were more gender balanced than the demographic averages for the region, but fairly large farms took the survey. And our average says 27.6 acres, but there were some huge farms that participated in the survey and a lot of small farms as well. And about less than half of the participants are certified organic. So it represents a pretty good kind of slice of vegetable and fruit growers in the Northeast. Okay, and I just want to give you a little brief intro into this concept of what do we mean by adaptation and adaptive management and changing management. So this little figure in the upper right here is about coping range. And so The line across the graph is kind of showing us the moisture deficit changes that maybe the farmer would experience over time. And that light gray shows the amount of kind of the range of moisture deficit that the farm is prepared to deal with. But if they maybe install irrigation, they increase their coping range, so they're able to deal with a greater degree or variation of moisture deficits. And so when we make adaptive make adaptive changes on the farm, we're kind of increasing our ability and our capacity to deal with climate-related risks. And this, of course, is part of like an ongoing process of repeatedly kind of thinking and planning and making changes for uncertainty. So I'm just going to give you some of the results from the survey. We asked a multiple choice question about practices that farmers use to manage for heavy precipitation on their farm. So this is quantitative data. On the high end, it's really a lot of those soil and crop management strategies that farmers are already using. So it's familiar tools in the toolbox, really high level use of soil health strategies. And this is, I'm just showing you the high end. This is part of like a much bigger bar chart. So that's just to give you a sense of what folks are doing. And then on the next slide here, this is kind of the highest responses for a similar question, multiple choice question about how far folks are managing drought on the farm. It's also high level of use of soil health, using cover crops. Efficient irrigation is really important. So being conserving water and increasing irrigation as well. So building soil health is kind of one of the bigger stories. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And what that multiple choice question allowed us to do is to look at whether or not farmers' site characteristics are correlated with different adaptation strategies. So we asked them about those practices they're already using to manage for precipitation extremes. We also asked folks about what kind of soils they were on, whether they're on steep slopes, if they're in the floodplain. And so we did some statistical analysis to see if there were significant relationships between site vulnerabilities or site characteristics and adaptations. And what we found is that there are. So we used this binomial logistic regression analysis, which basically lets you ask, can you predict the use of raised beds based on any of these kind of site characteristic variables? And I'm not going to show you all the results, but I will say that we can definitely share those with you, what we found. So, raised beds is one of those practices that we found had a number of correlations to site characteristics. So if you are a farmer in the Northeast and you're farming on steep slopes, you're 2.8 times more likely to be using raised beds. And you're also more likely to use raised beds if you have clay soils, and that makes sense, right? If you have clay soils, you want to be able to, they're prone to waterlogging. You want to be able to get the roots up and out of away from the water. Okay, so the survey also contained a whole bunch of open-ended questions. We asked farmers, without prompting what they should fill in. We asked them what changes they've made on their farm due to experience with drought or heavy precipitation. And then we asked them what they thought the most promising and innovative strategies were for dealing with those risks. And we asked the open-ended questions because we wanted to find out kind of what the innovations and the new ideas were out there in the farming community. So from a bigger perspective, the trends that we saw in the answers to those questions is that farmers are using really a new level of whole system site planning to think about heavy precipitation and flooding on their farms. They're making maps based on wet soils and erosive forest during floods, and really planning a whole bunch of different new stormwater management strategies. So that's both installing kind of drainage ditches and water catchment places where they've seen damage and kind of higher levels of risk on their site, but also kind of changing the grading of farm roads And there's more details in the report. I don't think I have time to like tell you about everything. We learned so much from this study, and I'm really hopeful that we can share it with the people that need to use it. So we talked about kind of the use of raised beds, and then there's a whole suite of strategies that showed up, some of them similar and some of them different for how folks are adapting to drought. So that same kind of systems level water planning, but in this case, more of like thinking about creating new water sources, harvesting water by putting in ponds or putting in catchment off roofs, really thinking about new ways to make sure that there's access. So folks talked about putting out storage bins in distant fields that they could store water in and know it's going to be there and easier to access during a time of drought. Of course, like irrigation is a big part of this story, but for a lot of farmers, they want to rely more on soil health rather than irrigation. Okay, and just to give you a sense of what the cusp of innovative adaptive management was like in this community that we surveyed, most of the responses were ideas that are already familiar, that people know how to use, and maybe they're using them in a new way or feel like they're the best solution. So soil building is kind of the biggest story. Folks feel like building good, healthy soil that's more like a sponge is going to be able to both, drain water when you have too much, but also hold it onto it and let your crops access it during times of drought. Raised beds, mulch, irrigation, water collection, cover crops, of course, and crop planting. Those are strategies that farmers already know how to use. But we did see some answers that showed up in this question about what's innovative and promising that didn't really show up elsewhere in the survey, and those are newer ideas. People are still kind of figuring out either how to make them productive or how to make them really work for diversified veg and fruit production systems. So that's no-till. We know there's lots of people, farmers and researchers out there trying to figure out how to make either silage tarps or roller crimpers or something work for no-till. But people are pretty excited about that. Agroforestry is another practice and strategy that farmers are thinking about a lot, as well as keyline, hugelkultur, and then education and also mitigating climate change. And those are considered adaptive strategies, which I think is pretty exciting. So that's that third point on this slide here, is that farmers view education, mitigation, and planning as adaptive. So it's not just about practices on the farm, but when you ask the question, what do you think is the most innovative and promising strategy for dealing with heavy precipitation events on your farm? The response is, addressing the drivers of climate change by reducing my energy consumption, driving my tractor less, changing my energy source to solar panels, and trying to sequester carbon in the soil. So I think that's pretty exciting that coming from the farming community, that there's a link to addressing climate change drivers. Folks talked about the need for more peer-to-peer and technical support and education as adaptation, and just like planning, like really thinking long-term. Notably, I think, our survey indicates what farmers are doing, but it doesn't really assess if the strategies are working. So there's a huge need for, I think, both farmers and researchers to evaluate which strategies work and how well do they work, and to what thresholds of climate impact do they work. And then this middle point here is also interesting. Some farmers talked about financial safety nets as being important. We saw a really low level use of reported use of crop insurance from this community, but saying that when they're impacted by one of those kind of bigger events, like a big serious storm, that community farm funds, kind of those emergency relief funds, have been really critical in supporting them to continue farming. So I think on the next slide here, I've got the reported use of crop insurance that farmers are using to support them in bouncing back from climate change, which is pretty low, 9%, 7%. And I know that a lot of folks are working on trying to figure out how to make crop insurance work better for those highly diversified and kind of like intensively rotated vegetable production systems. Yes, and so I mentioned this a little bit, but soil health and cover crops are kind of the most used adaptation strategies by these farmers. Over 70% of farmers say that they already use cover crops and soil health to help them deal with heavy precipitation events, and most farmers also use them to help them adapt to drought. But not only are they in a high level of use, but they're also really considered adaptive, considered innovative and promising. So here's just some of the farmer quotes about this topic from our open-ended questions about it. Farmers consider no-till systems with cover cropping to support their capacity to reduce erosion. They want to avoid bare soil at all costs, right? So to both protect the soil from the damage done by heavy precipitation and erosion, but also that protects moisture from leaving during times of drought, so you get less evaporation. Just really a sense that high quality soil is more resilient, and that the biology is a big part of that, and creating that sponge that we know is so important. Okay, mulch is also another strategy that came up a lot in those open-ended questions, and people talked about using the plastic mulches, and how they kind of act as an insurance that their crops are going to do well, because the mulch is going to protect the soil from erosion and also from evaporation. And I would say, during some of the conversations that we had, folks said, like, I use mulch. It's really important to help me protect against extreme weather, but I wish I didn't have to use so much plastic in my farm. So there's a need. Somebody's got to innovate, like a paper-based mulch or something. Everybody wants it right now. We also saw that there's a lot of new crop selection and planting happening because of climate change and how people think about climate change. So people are planting more perennials because they're more resilient, but also thinking about new and different varieties that either are more drought resistant or tolerate heavy moisture. Of course, high tunnels. When I was in Pennsylvania, some of the farmers talked about getting 3 times their annual average rainfall the season before, and they were like, at that level, soil health, at the healthiest soil, we've reached this threshold of impact where the only place that I could plant was in high tunnels, or where I had laid down tarps, or where I had row covers. And it just reminds me, the story of climate change impacts on farms in the Northeast is one that comes with an incredible amount of loss. And, my research has tried to be really focused on solutions, but everybody has a story of, thinking about not keeping going after being hit really hard. Anyways, they really appreciate the cost sharing from the NRCS. Okay, so here's a couple of pictures from my friend Justin Rich, who's a farmer in Huntington, Vermont, of his very tall raised beds there, just demonstrating how a lot of farmers are using the raised beds with the plastic mulch. And the next one is just making sure that there's always cover, especially on slopes. So using the plastic mulch, but then also putting in hay or straw, or, some people are even putting in living mulch in the pathways, especially on slopes, so you don't lose the soil. One thing I really like that Justin does on his farm is he's subsoiling in the pathways. And so if you can imagine this field with the plastic mulch getting hit with 2 to 4 inches of rain, like, where is the water going to go? It can't infiltrate through the plastic mulch, and so it all ends up in the pathways. And so the more that you can increase infiltration and water flow into the soil in the pathways, the less water is going to end up pooling and saturating or running off. And so the subsoiler is basically this deep shank that goes into the soil, and it has kind of breaks of compaction down below. It's hard to see. It's right behind that little cultivator thing there. If you're a farmer, you know what I'm talking about. Okay. And here's just some quotes from farmers about doing a new level of whole system site planning. So people talked about making new maps of their farm based on flooding, and also wet sites. Some folks talked about changing the size of their rotation plots to account for how big the wet spots on their fields were, because it's, getting into the field in the early spring, it's just not as reliable that it's going to be dry now. And so if you can break up your field rotation sizes so that they kind of fit, then you can maybe get into one part of the field and leave those wet spots for another time. Not easy. Okay, and this is also just a big theme, right, that is supporting farms' capacity to bounce back from both drought and heavy precipitation events. So when the water comes, farmers are thinking about how can I control it, prevent it from doing damage on my site, catch it, and then store it so that I have it during times of drought. And so people talk about using rain barrels, farm ponds, new like diversion ditches, and just ways to catch it. So just want to talk about this term of resilience that we use so much in this conversation. We want farms to be resilient to climate change. What does that mean? There are a lot of different frameworks for understanding that. Usually it means a farm's capacity to both absorb or deflect or adapt to or kind of transform in the face of some kind of adverse impact. And I think what resonates with farmers most is thinking about resiliency as not just bouncing back or absorbing shocks, but transforming in a way that lets you move forward. So it's about bouncing forward. And I like this little image to think about that. Resilience is about bouncing forward. And it's a buzzword. And I really like it as a word, but I am in the research world and I like to use a different term instead of resilience because I think it's a little bit more descriptive. So this idea of adaptive capacity, I think really means the same kind of thing. So the adaptive capacity means a farm's capability or capacity to adapt to climate change, to deal with it in any kind of way. So I use an asset-based lens for understanding change and a farm's capacity to transform and deal with climate change. And that means that I look at all these different types of assets that influence a farm's capacity to adapt. So we've got natural capital, built capital. I'll explain those in a minute. But I'm really focused on adaptive capacity as kind of a synonym for resilience. But of course, a farm's capacity to adapt is only as good as its ability to deal with all the other stressors and pressures. If a farm is dealing with really thin margins on the edge of kind of economic viability, they're not going to have the capacity to do long-term planning or changes to adapt to climate change. So we have to understand that really just the state and the health of agriculture is influencing whether or not those farms can successfully deal with climate change. So we have to think about everything as part of this picture and how they can be resilient. So we know that farms are concerned about intergenerational transfer. Labor challenges is a big concern for farmers right now. New pest and disease pressures are some of their biggest concerns, as well as new regulatory pressures. It's a big deal at Vermont right now. And just market stability and availability. So in our survey, we did ask some questions about adaptive capacity and vulnerability. I think this slide is, I like this story here. So we asked this question, on a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you agree with these statements? And the first one there is we asked farmers about this statement, I understand the vulnerability of my farmland to extreme weather conditions. And the majority of farmers who took the survey said, yes, I agree, like I get it. I understand how vulnerable my farm is to extreme weather. But when we asked them about their capacity to deal with those extreme weather threats and climate change, we got a different story. So when we asked them if they have the knowledge and technical skill to deal with weather-related threats to the viability of their farm operation, over 30% of them said, no, I don't have the knowledge and technical skill to successfully deal with that. And then the last one there on that last slide was whether or not farmers have the financial capacity to deal with weather-related threats. And I think, less than 20% of farmers think they have the financial capacity. So the majority of farmers really need more technical knowledge and skills and increased financial capacity to deal with weather-related threats. Thanks, Jennifer. Okay, so This last piece of research that I want to tell you about is this listening tour we conducted last winter. So we went back to those same farmer network meetings where we had conducted the survey, and we presented the survey results back to farmers, and then we hosted some focus groups and farmer to farmer conversations about, like what's useful and interesting from the survey results, and then also ask them 2 key questions that we felt like would be helpful to kind of pushing the bigger conversation forward about how we can support farms in being resilient to climate change. So we asked them, from their perspective, what resources they already use to support farm resilience to climate change. And then we also asked them about which resources they need to support them in adapting to climate change. And we defined resources using that kind of asset-based framework that I mentioned before. So there's lots of different resources that farmers can draw on to support their resilience to climate change. Primarily farmers talk about natural capital or natural assets. So that's soil, that's their really their land base, the biodiversity of their site and their farm. But there's also physical resources that they draw on. So that could be hoop houses. A pond would be another type of kind of physical infrastructure that a farmer could use to support resilience. Informational resources include kind of maybe using growing degree days as a new way to think about planning. Farm maps would be informational resources. There's lots of different informational resources that farmers can draw on to support resilience. More accurate weather predictions is one of those kind of like seasonal outlooks. I think folks are excited about having accurate weather predictions kind of farther out. And of course, financial resources are so important, especially when farmers suffer huge loss. So insurance counts as a financial resource, as do markets, grants, educational resources for resilience. I think there's a lot more, there's a lot of energy being put on building more educational resources for farmers in this topic. The Climate Hub is working on that. There are workshops, direct technical assistance. There's different types of planning support out there. This next one, human resources, is a really important thing. And that's like, do I have the knowledge? Like, do I have the personal confidence that I can deal with this, that I can keep going? Do I have enough grit to continue to farm in the face of climate change? When you talk to farmers personally about farming in the face of climate change, I think this is a really big thing. There's a lot of anxiety in those stories about having lost a lot or moved their farm because of an experience with flooding. So the human piece, kind of the confidence is important. And then there's equipment, having a seed drill, having a bed hiller. And the one I think that maybe I cut it off is social capital. So community connections, having relationships with people that can come and support all of the other pieces. Okay, so what we heard from farmers in those conversations, we asked them about what resources they use and resources that they want. Farmers are they're already investing in soil and water management, their crop management, their site level water planning, infrastructure and hoop houses, those things we talked about from the survey results. That's where the majority of farmers are investing in to support their resilience. And that's where they have the most experience. They're experts and technicians in doing this kind of work on their farm, and they're doing the best they can with these kind of visible resources for resilience to support their capacity to deal with climate change. But what we heard, I think, more in terms of what farmers want as increased resources for resilience is more of these invisible ones. So they talked about, on the far left, I've got the Vermont Farm Fund there, but they talked about those emergency financial safety nets as being really critical to helping them continue to go back to farming and to make it through kind of like a big climate shock. Community relationships is also one of those key pieces that they talked about supporting them and bouncing back from kind of a bigger climate event. So, one farmer talked about how after she lost a bunch of animals from a flood, it was devastating. One day, all of her like ski buddies, that whole social network she'd known through skiing, showed up to support her and clean up on the farm. Another day, all of her kind of like parent networks from her kids' dance classes showed up. And those community relationships not only kind of support folks at that end, but also are the kind of the link to reliable local markets and other resources too. Farmers ask for more peer learning. They want opportunities to do problem solving with other farmers and extension professionals in the room at the same time, that kind of collaborative, adaptive learning that happens when you have lots of different expertise to do problem solving that happens at conferences. They'd love to see more of that. I know there's some cool programs that are trying to build that peer learning capacity and opportunities for that to happen. Folks would love to have more extension and technical support. I know NRCS agents and extension do this already, but they would love to have more extension professionals, somebody with water engineering background who can show up on your farm and do the kind of site level water planning with you that maybe you just don't have the personal technical expertise for. So I know that's a big thing to fund, but that would really help farmers if we had more extension professionals that had expertise in climate change. Farmers love the NRCS EQIP and other grant programs. They talked about relying on that and lots of other cost sharing programs, and they would love to see some grants or cost shares that are really directed towards supporting climate resilience on farms. And this last piece is the reliable local markets, and that's some folks talked about how they just don't get paid enough for the cost of producing food, and how important it is to have local markets that they can rely on to sell their crops at a good price. And I know that the organic farming associations really work on building local markets and doing consumer education, and there are other folks that do that too, but farmers would love to feel like they're better supported by the local economy. So with that, I think I've shared all of the just a summary of our research that I'm hoping can be helpful to you today. And I want to end by thanking I had a team of wonderful interns that helped me with the survey. Sarah Sims, who's farming now, Phoebe Tucker, who works for NOFA Vermont, Kyle Weatherhog, she works for the Vermont Youth Conservation Corps, Ben Fisher, Allie Pankoff from the second year, who now works for NRCS, and then my advisors, and of course, like the farmer groups, the farmers, and my funders. And I think I've got one more slide there's the link to the report from the survey. We don't have a report based on those focus groups yet, but we hope to have that out this winter. And with that, I just want to thank you all for tuning in to hear about my research, and I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Alissa. That was fantastic. We just want to let people know that if you joined late, you can type a question into the chat. Alissa's happy to answer any questions you have about her research. And while you're thinking about the questions you want to ask, Alissa, I'll just ask, I may have missed it, but how did you find the farmers to participate in the survey?
Oh, great. Yeah, so we partnered with farmer organizations and networks, and we set up a table at conferences and meetings with the survey, and we had fair trade chocolate bars and a really great donation from Bees Wrap. And so I was there with the team of 4 undergraduate interns, and we just asked people that were walking by if they were willing to take our survey. So it's a convenience sample, but it worked.
Great. Do folks have any questions for Alissa? Give it a minute. And while people are thinking, I'll also mention that our next webinar, which is also on the topic of climate change in the food system, is on December 17th. And that will be with Erin Lane from the USDA Climate Hub. And she's going to give us some background on what the USDA Climate Hub is and what they do. and issues that they're working on. So be sure to keep an eye out for signing up for that. All right, great. It looks like we have our first question. So Mark says, regarding farm business viability, could you share more about specific technical assistance needs of farmers? Where do they want, what do they want and need support, and what technical assistance is most beneficial to the farm business viability?
That's a great question. I think when folks talked about wanting more technical assistance, the specifics that we heard were primarily that they want help doing landscape level water planning on their farms. And so I'm trying to think if there were specific comments about business planning. I don't think we got any really specific comments about business planning. I'm sorry. They definitely asked for it, but it wasn't like, this is what I'd love to see in a farm viability plan. They definitely talked about some of the farm viability programs being helpful and supportive. Looks like we have a couple other questions.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I don't have more for you, Mark. Would it be possible to see a research paper, and how would it be possible for a student like myself to help out with similar research to what you are doing? Cool. So there's another student here. Yeah, so the survey report is kind of the best thing we have to share the research at this point. And I have a couple manuscripts from my master's research that I've submitted for publication, and I wish they were accepted and that I could just send them to you right now. If you want to just email me privately, maybe there might be stuff that I could share with you. I'm definitely in favor of getting this research and data out to people that can use it. Okay, and then Melissa, your question is, do you have a written summary of recommended strategies that you can direct me to? And is it okay if we share with farmers that we work with here in Massachusetts? Oh yeah, absolutely. So the survey report is kind of the best summary that we have. We're working with Erin Lane at the Climate Hub to kind of produce a little like 2-page summary of recommended strategies. There are also some recommendations from some of the USDA Climate Hub, Northeast Climate Hub, that can be helpful, but I think the survey report is the kind of the main piece that we can share with you right now. Absolutely share it with other folks. I'm into that. Okay. Yeah, and the survey report, it's on the WordPress website. It's also on the SARE website, and it sounds like there is or will be a link on the Food Alliance website as well. Thanks, Sam. From Dan Hunter, did farmers talk about shifting labor needs and strategies? Yes, absolutely. A lot of farmers around here had to shift to a lot more hand labor when they couldn't get tractor pulled cultivators and harvesters in the field. Yeah, absolutely. We did ask farmers about kind of like advantages and disadvantages of some of the adaptation strategies. And I would say that like the amount of time that things take is like a huge factor that gets taken in to whether or not to use a new practice, especially when it came to irrigation. So a lot of farmers talked about part of the reason that they installed certain irrigation equipment or pieces was so that they had to spend less time dealing with getting water out to crops later. And I have heard from others that, yeah, so I think Sonia Berthstell over at the University of Maine did some quick analysis to try to figure out whether or not the growing season was extending the amount of time that farmers could be in the field. And what she found is that because of the increase in wet weather in the spring, there's actually a reduced number of field working days. And so even though you might get like a couple more days of the season because it's warmer, the wet weather is offsetting that. And so getting into the field in the spring is a huge challenge for everyone, but there's just kind of less time to get in and do what you need to do, especially if you're working with equipment. And I think I recently was on a panel with some farmers, and they talked about abandoning some crops because they just couldn't get in there to weed and harvest because the soil was too wet. So that's a major issue. don't have, I'm trying to think if there were specific solutions to that. Let's see, did you ask farmers about financial barriers to implementing adaptation strategies? We didn't ask that specific question, but that definitely came through as a big theme. So, you know, a lot of the great adaptation strategies are really time and financially, they're both time and monetary intensive. So they either cost a lot of money, or they take a lot of time, or they take a lot of labor. And those are certainly limiting factors in the decisions that farmers make about adapting to climate change. If we all had lots more money to support farms, and we had extra time and tons of labor to get out there, I think there'd be a really different story as far as what farmers have been able to invest in terms of adaptation. Yeah, they would love to see even like mini grants or cost shares for some of the adaptation strategies, like irrigation and you know, maybe putting in ponds or new wells. That would be great to see. The folks that took our survey really appreciated the cost shares for the hoop houses, which protect, you know, from both kind of from heavy precipitation events. Great questions. Thanks everybody for coming. And it's great to see so many folks show up.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks for your questions. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to mark your calendars for December 17th. And you can see a list of the other webinars we have on our website, as well as a recording of this with the slides. So if you want to reference back to anything that Alissa spoke about today, you'll be able to find it on our website. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll sign off.